The 3rd of March, 1943. The Bismarck Sea, off the northeastern coast of New Guinea. A Japanese convoy of 16 ships, 8 transports, and 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura is running the final stretch toward Leh, carrying an entire infantry division and thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition the garrison there desperately needs. Out of the low morning haze, American B-25 Mitchells come in barely above wave height, noses no longer glassed over for a bombardier, but packed solid with machine guns, firing continuously into the ship's decks as they close the range, clearing away anti-aircraft gun crews in the seconds before their bombs skip across the water and slam into the hulls below the waterline. By the time it is over, every one of the convoy's 8 transports and 4 of its 8 destroyers are sunk. Fewer than 1,000 of the division's soldiers ever reach New Guinea. The Americans lose 13 airmen. Pause on that. An aircraft originally built to drop bombs from altitude, flown by crews trained for a very different kind of mission, had just gutted an entire troop convoy almost by itself. This is not a story about one lopsided naval battle. This is the story of how a single officer's improvised modification, welded together in a hangar in Australia only a few months earlier, turned the B-25 Mitchell into the weapon Japanese shipping crews in the Southwest Pacific came to dread more than almost anything else in the sky, and of the personal grief that helped drive the man who built it. Part 1. The B-25 that reached the 5th Air Force in the Pacific in 1942 had been designed as a conventional medium bomber, meant to fly level at altitude and drop its bombs on fixed targets from a bombardier station in a glazed nose. That approach worked reasonably well against stationary targets. It worked far less well against small, fast-moving, camouflaged convoys threading through the reefs and channels of the Southwest Pacific, ships that could maneuver out from under a level bombing run in the time it took bombs to fall from several thousand feet. General George Kenney, who took command of the 5th Air Force in August 1942, recognized quickly that the doctrine his aircraft had been built around simply did not fit the war he was actually fighting in New Guinea, and he began looking for a different answer. The New Guinea campaign itself had already demonstrated, well before the Bismarck Sea, how badly conventional level bombing suited the theater's geography. Convoys moved through narrow straits and coastal channels, overhung by mountains and cloud, giving them ample opportunity to hide or scatter under the kind of high-altitude bombing that worked reasonably well over open ocean or fixed industrial targets in Europe. Every wasted sortie against a convoy that slipped away cost fuel, aircraft hours, and crew fatigue the 5th Air Force could not easily spare in a theater perpetually short of both aircraft and spare parts. Part 2. That answer arrived largely through the improvisation of Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, a former naval aviator and pre-war Philippine Airlines pilot who had already built a reputation in the theater as the man who could fix, modify, or simply make work almost any aircraft handed to him. Gunn had a deeply personal stake in the war beyond ordinary duty. His wife and 4 children had been trapped in Manila when the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941, and by January 1942, the whole family was interned at the Santo Tomas camp, where they would remain for the next 3 years under conditions that left them, by the time of their eventual liberation in February 1945, near starvation. Colleagues who worked alongside Gunn through 1942 and 1943 consistently described a man driven by that knowledge, throwing himself into modification work with an urgency that went well beyond routine wartime obligation. Gunn's reputation for improvisation predated the Strafer conversion by several months. He had already become known across the theater as an officer willing to bypass normal supply channels and standard procedure entirely to get aircraft flying, reportedly using whatever combination of scrounged parts, borrowed tools, and personal persuasion was needed to keep a chronically undersupplied Air Force in the air. That reputation is part of why Kenney trusted him with an idea as radical as tearing the bombardier's station out of a standard bomber and replacing it with a battery of machine guns, a modification no manual anywhere had specified, and no factory back in the United States had approved. Part 3. Working out of Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane starting around November and December of 1942, Gunn, together with Jack Fox, North American Aviation's senior technical representative in the theater, stripped the glazed bombardier's nose off a B-25 and replaced it with a solid metal nose packed with machine guns, eventually carrying as many as 8 forward-firing 50-caliber Brownings on some airframes, supplemented by additional guns mounted along the fuselage sides, on top and in the tail. Kenney ordered enough conversions completed to outfit an entire squadron, and by early February 1943, the 90th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Bomb Group was flying combat missions with fully converted Strafer B-25's, an aircraft that had gone, in a matter of weeks, from a level bomber with a glass nose to something closer to a flying gun battery. The added weight of 8 machine guns and their ammunition, concentrated entirely in the aircraft's nose, where a lighter bomb sight and bombardier station had previously sat, shifted the Mitchell's center of gravity forward enough that pilots had to relearn some of the aircraft's handling characteristics, particularly on takeoff and during low-speed maneuvering, a real engineering cost that came with the conversion's undeniable combat benefits. Ground crews maintaining Strafer squadrons also took on a heavier workload, servicing several times the machine guns and ammunition feed systems of a standard bomber, alongside the aircraft's existing systems, in the same understaffed, undersupplied conditions that had already made Gunn's reputation for improvisation necessary in the first place. Part 4. Firepower alone was not the whole innovation. Kenney and his aide, Major Bill Benn, had already been developing a technique called skip bombing, releasing bombs at extremely low altitude and high speed so that they skipped across the water's surface like a thrown stone, before slamming into a ship's hull just above the waterline, a method that let a fast-moving bomber attack a ship far more like a torpedo run than a conventional bomb run. Paired with Gunn's Strafer conversion, the tactic became devastatingly efficient. B-25's worked in coordinated pairs, one aircraft raking a ship's deck with sustained machine gun fire to kill or scatter the anti-aircraft gun crews defending it, while its partner skipped bombs into the hull at almost the same moment, the machine gun fire suppressing exactly the defensive fire that would otherwise have made such a low, slow, exposed attack run suicidal. Skip bombing itself required a level of pilot precision that took real training to develop safely, since releasing a bomb even slightly too high sent it arcing over the target entirely, while releasing too low or too fast risked the bomb detonating close enough to damage the releasing aircraft itself. Kenney's crews drilled the technique against wrecked ship hulls and coastal targets around Australia and New Guinea before ever attempting it against a live defended convoy, refining exact release altitudes and airspeeds through repeated practice runs that left little room for a pilot's individual guesswork once the real attack began. Part 5. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, fought over the 2nd through 4th of March 1943, put both innovations to their first full test against a target that mattered enormously to the wider New Guinea campaign. Japanese commanders were trying to reinforce their forces at Lae and Salamaua with the 51st Infantry Division, moving the troops and their supplies by sea because New Guinea's terrain made an overland approach impractical. Allied reconnaissance and code-breaking had tracked the convoy's departure and course for days beforehand, giving Kenney's forces time to plan a coordinated, multi-wave attack, rather than relying on a single lucky interception. When the strafers and skip bombers reached the convoy on the 3rd of March, the combination of suppressed anti-aircraft fire and precisely delivered skip bombs proved close to unstoppable. Every transport and half the escorting destroyers went to the bottom within a single day of concentrated attack, at a cost the Americans could sustain and the Japanese could not. Rear Admiral Kimura himself survived the battle, though wounded, one of relatively few senior officers from the convoy to escape the wider disaster, and Japanese accounts of the engagement afterward described the sheer speed of the loss, an entire reinforcement convoy effectively destroyed within a single day of concentrated air attack, as a serious blow to the wider effort to hold New Guinea against the advancing Allied campaign. The battle is generally regarded by historians of the Pacific War as one of the clearest demonstrations of what land-based air power alone could do to interdict an enemy convoy without any friendly surface fleet engagement at all. Part 6. It would be a mistake to credit the Strafer nose alone for a victory that depended on several things arriving together at the same moment. Days of prior reconnaissance and signals intelligence gave Kenney's forces the convoy's position and schedule well before the attack began. Land-based heavy bombers and conventional medium bombers flying from higher altitude contributed their own separate attacks across the engagement. And the skip bombing technique itself, developed independently of Gunn's gun conversion, supplied the actual killing blow against each ship's hull. The Strafer nose's specific contribution was narrower but essential. It kept anti-aircraft gunners' heads down at exactly the moment a skip bombing run required an unusually long, slow, low approach that would otherwise have been catastrophically exposed. Japanese shipping crews who survived encounters with Strafer-modified B-25's afterward had good reason to fear the type specifically, since a Strafer attack meant a sustained hail of 50 caliber fire sweeping their own deck in the seconds before a bomb ever struck the hull. A very different, more personally threatening experience than a high-altitude bombing run most crews could at least watch coming from a distance. Japanese military planners drew their own lesson from the disaster, largely abandoning further attempts to reinforce New Guinea's coastal garrisons by large, slow convoy after the Bismarck Sea, shifting instead towards smaller, faster vessels moved individually at night in an effort to reduce the risk of exactly the kind of concentrated daylight air attack that had destroyed Kimura's convoy so completely. A tactical adjustment that itself stands as a kind of grim complement to how effective the combined Strafer and skip bombing attack had been. None of that adaptation reversed the underlying imbalance the Bismarck Sea had exposed. Once Japanese convoys were reduced to smaller, faster, night-moving vessels rather than large daylight formations, the total tonnage of supplies and reinforcements that could reach New Guinea's garrisons dropped sharply. A logistics squeeze that compounded over the following months, even without any single battle as dramatic as the Bismarck Sea to market. Whatever fear Japanese merchant crews and troop transports came to feel toward a Strafer-modified B-25 by 1944, as the modification spread beyond the original 90th Bomb Squadron to other units across the theater, it was a fear grounded in a very specific, very physical experience, rather than an abstract reputation. The sound and sight of a heavy machine gun barrage sweeping across a ship's own deck in the seconds before a bomb ever struck. A far more immediate and personal threat than a high-altitude raid most crews could at least see coming from a comfortable distance and shelter from below decks. Pappy Gunn did not stop innovating after the Bismarck Sea. He went on to apply similar gun conversions to the smaller A-20 Havoc and continued refining Strafer tactics and aircraft modifications for the rest of the Pacific campaign, remaining one of the theater's most valued unofficial engineers, even as his own family remained interned in Manila without any assurance he would ever see them again. That reunion finally came in February 1945, when American forces liberated Santo Tomas, and Gunn's wife and children, malnourished but alive after 3 years of internment, were freed. Gunn survived the war, returned to civil aviation in the Philippines afterward, and helped rebuild Philippine Airlines in the post-war years. He died on the 11th of October 1957, when a chartered Beechcraft he was piloting between Mindanao and Manila crashed in a storm, killing everyone aboard, including several American businessmen and the son of the Philippine ambassador to the United States. General George Kenney, who had backed Gunn's improvisation and built 5th Air Force doctrine around it, went on to a long post-war Air Force career and remained one of the most publicly credited air commanders of the Pacific War. Gunn's own modifications continued evolving after the Bismarck Sea, incorporating feedback from squadrons actually flying the converted aircraft in combat, adjustments to gun mounting, ammunition capacity, and nose armor that later Strafer variants carried as standard equipment rather than field improvisation, a sign of how quickly what had started as one officer's workaround became formal 5th Air Force doctrine. Julia Gunn and her siblings, freed from Santo Tomas in February 1945 alongside their mother, grew up afterward with a father whose wartime reputation was, for years, better known within Air Force circles than to the wider public, one of a long list of Pacific War innovators whose contributions mattered enormously to the men who served alongside them without ever becoming a household name, the way some of the war's more publicized aces and generals did. The Strafer conversion's legacy outlived the specific squadrons that first flew it, influencing later American ground attack aircraft doctrine well beyond the Pacific theater and the Second World War itself. an early demonstration of how effectively concentrated forward-firing machine gun fire could substitute for the defensive vulnerability inherent in any low, slow attack run. A lesson later applied to gunship aircraft in wars fought decades after Pappy Gunn's original hangar improvisation in Brisbane. None of it looked inevitable from where Kenney and Gunn stood in late 1942, working with a shortage of aircraft, a shortage of spare parts, and a theater command structure back in the United States that had not yet fully grasped how different the air war over New Guinea's jungle and coastline was from the air war being planned for Europe. What eventually reshaped anti-shipping doctrine across the whole Pacific theater began as a stopgap, built by hand, to solve an immediate problem with whatever material happened to be sitting in a hangar in Brisbane. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these, more aircraft that became something their original designers never intended, because one determined officer, often for reasons far more personal than any official after-action report ever recorded, decided the standard version simply was not good enough for the war actually being fought. The B-25 that first rolled off North American's assembly line was built to drop bombs from altitude. The one that gutted a Japanese division's reinforcement convoy in the Bismarck Sea was built, in a hangar in Brisbane, by a man whose own family was starving in a prison camp 4,000 miles away.